The monarchy had endured scandals, betrayals, fractured marriages, and storms of public scrutiny before, yet this moment carried a different gravity. This was no whispered gossip behind palace doors. It arrived as a formal legal judgment, delivered in measured, unyielding language that left King Charles visibly shaken and stripped Queen Camilla of an authority more enduring than any jewel in the royal collection. In that single stroke, the carefully maintained illusion surrounding her position within the royal family began to fracture. Before we examine the deeper implications for the institution and those bound to it, I ask that you subscribe so these reflections on power, legacy, and human frailty reach you without delay. Charles sat alone in a familiar chamber at Buckingham Palace, the official seat where monarchs have long navigated the weight of decisions. The ruling lay open before him. He read the final paragraph once, then returned to it with deliberate care, as if the words might yield some unforeseen mercy upon closer inspection. The judges had ruled unequivocally that Camilla possessed no legal claim to a protected collection of royal heirlooms linked to the late queen's private lineage. These encompassed jewels, ceremonial artifacts, and personal items steeped in generations of memory and significance. Camilla observed him from across the room, her composure masking the quiet recognition of loss. No explanation was required. The implications settled between them like an unyielding presence. A royal heirloom represents far more than material value or ornamental beauty in the eyes of those who understand the quiet architecture of monarchy. It endures as a vessel of family history, status, and emotional resonance that transcends mere financial measure or fleeting fashion. These objects carry the imprint of generations, the weight of ceremonies long past, and the unspoken promises made between sovereigns and their lineage. The ruling affirmed these pieces belonged neither to marital acquisitions nor to the broader influence of the crown in a manner accessible through Camilla's position. They were tethered instead to a private continuum of memory, one deliberately insulated from the ordinary currents of court life. The crown itself embodies the legal and symbolic heart of the monarchy, a framework of authority built over centuries, yet even its reach encountered firm boundaries here. Charles could not redirect these treasures on her behalf, regardless of personal inclination or the quiet urgings of spousal loyalty. The silence in the room deepened into something almost tangible, a shared recognition of limits that no title could fully erase. He set the file down with a measured gesture that conveyed the finality of the moment to Camilla without utterance, the small movement echoing larger fractures within the institution they both inhabited. For Charles, the judgment brought a rising sense of humiliation that settled heavily upon his shoulders as king, for it denied his wife while simultaneously exposing limits to his own authority as sovereign in ways he had not anticipated. The man who wore the crown found himself reminded that power, even at its apex, operates within invisible confines shaped by predecessors. Camilla experienced the wound differently, confronting the reality that her title as Queen Consort did not grant passage through every locked chamber of familial history or confer automatic belonging to its most guarded traditions. A sealed appendix to the ruling altered the atmosphere further, introducing layers of documentation that spoke volumes in their restraint. This additional section, often employed to furnish supporting details discreetly, referenced a protective family instruction that had guided the proceedings from their inception, a quiet directive whose influence now revealed itself fully. Palace aides grasped the inherent peril at once, understanding how such matters could ripple outward. The judges had rejected the claim while honoring a directive potent enough to constrain the king himself, underscoring that legacy often holds greater sway than present circumstance. Charles stood without speaking, the burden of his role pressing upon him with renewed force, a man caught between duty to the past and devotion in the present. Camilla remained seated in the aftermath, absorbing the personal diminishment of what had been withheld with a composure that masked the deeper currents of disappointment and self-examination. Near the doorway, an aide murmured that William and Anne must be informed before any subsequent actions unfolded, recognizing the necessity of containing the matter within the circle of those whose loyalties were most directly engaged. Yet this legal determination represented merely the opening chapter in a larger, unfolding narrative of family dynamics. Behind the formal defeat stood four figures whose private wounds, long-held commitments, and differing understandings of duty now converged publicly, each carrying their own interpretation of responsibility shaped by years of experience within the institution. A court ruling may present as orderly and dispassionate on parchment, but within the royal family, each phrase resonates with blood, recollection, recollection, the weight of shared history, and the echoes of betrayal accumulated over decades of public and private pressures. For Charles, it signified humiliation and a profound challenge to his role as protector and husband. For Camilla, it registered as a pointed rejection of her place within the deeper narrative of the family's legacy. For William, it became an act of necessary protection for symbols that transcended any single individual's desires or needs. For Princess Anne, it was unswerving duty, a straightforward adherence to what had been established by their mother and the principles she upheld. The judges had concluded their work with clinical precision, but the emotional reckoning belonged to those remaining amid the aftermath, navigating relationships strained by history, obligation, and the inescapable tension between personal affection and institutional preservation. Charles sensed the judgment pursuing him long after the document was closed and set aside, its implications following him through the familiar corridors of power and into rare moments of solitude where reflection could not be avoided. Its language had been clinical and detached from emotion, yet the injury struck at the personal core of a man who had long balanced the demands of his public role with the complexities of private affection and loyalty. As king, he embodied the expectation of rising above doubt, personal frailty, and the ordinary vulnerabilities of life, but the decision illuminated a stark and uncomfortable truth. His authority, however elevated, could not supersede the late queen's carefully safeguarded intentions, no matter the depth of his wishes or the strength of his arguments. This held profound significance because the monarchy persists not solely through symbols, pageantry, and ceremonial display, but through a deep fidelity to collective memory and the quiet continuity that binds one generation to the next in an unbroken chain. Should Charles appear to reshape that memory for Camilla's sake or in response to immediate pressures, the consequences would eclipse mere personal embarrassment. It would suggest that the crown itself might yield to private influence in ways that could undermine its very foundation and the trust placed in it by the public and history alike. Camilla bore a distinct pain, one forged through years of assuming a role the public sentiment had never wholly embraced as its own, a position marked by both moments of elevation and persistent, often unspoken questions of belonging and legitimacy. The court had inscribed a boundary no official statement or carefully worded explanation could fully obscure or soften with diplomatic phrasing, leaving an indelible mark on how Camilla viewed her standing. Marriage had conferred status, proximity to the centers of power, and certain privileges that accompanied elevation within the royal sphere, yet it withheld the deeper inheritance rooted in trust, bloodline, or the ancestral memory that others within the family circle accepted as inherent and unquestioned. A trust, in essence, constitutes a safeguarded legal and moral arrangement dictating control and succession of assets with layers of intention, protection, and foresight built into its very structure over time. For Camilla, this delineation cut profoundly, highlighting the sometimes painful distinctions between formal title and a more complete sense of acceptance within the family's most guarded traditions and private histories. She stood beside Charles in ceremony and companionship, sharing the public stage and private moments of life at the pinnacle, yet remained excluded from the most sanctified recesses of the family's heritage, a reality that carried both the necessity of maintaining public poise and the heavier weight of private reflection on one's place in a long and complex historical narrative. This isolation manifested not in dramatic gestures, but in the subtle daily reminders of limitation, prompting deeper contemplation on the nature of belonging when titles alone prove insufficient to bridge certain divides. William anticipated that the forthcoming discussions would prove complex and emotionally charged, requiring careful navigation of competing perspectives, long-held grievances, differing interpretations of fairness, and the future implications for the institution as a whole in an era of heightened scrutiny. Catherine attended closely to the conversation, aware that a single ill-chosen remark might transmute obligation into unintended harshness or deepen existing divides within an already delicate family structure strained by public expectations. William harbored no desire to punish Camilla or assert dominance for its own sake, but sought instead to preserve emblems and artifacts that had already withstood considerable suffering, public examination, and the passage of turbulent decades marked by both triumph and tragedy. Anne entered the broader discussions without preamble or need for external validation, her presence marked by characteristic directness, a clear sense of purpose, and an unwavering commitment to principles established long before. She regarded the heirlooms as never intended for deployment in quests for enhanced personal legitimacy or as bargaining elements in matters of status and recognition, her conviction lending an edge to her composure and a clarity that cut through layers of ambiguity and emotion. The palace inventory review then introduced fresh disclosures that complicated the landscape further and brought previously hidden tensions to light in unavoidable ways. Certain disputed items had been quietly sought for forthcoming occasions prior to the judicial outcome, revealing preparations already set in motion behind the scenes with varying degrees of discretion. Charles uncovered a more disquieting fact through these inquiries. Anne had cautioned officials months prior that any shift in control would provoke legal opposition, a warning now vindicated by the ruling itself and its firm language. The space seemed to contract around this revelation, each participant viewing the crisis through lenses of personal stake, institutional duty, long-held convictions, and differing interpretations of what loyalty truly required in such complex and layered circumstances. To fully comprehend the ruling's potency and the deeper forces that shaped its eventual outcome, one must revisit in careful detail a private episode that elevated what began as a seemingly minor domestic discord into a royal fracture with lasting implications for all involved and the institution they served with varying degrees of personal investment. Royal crises frequently originate in moments that are later minimized, reframed, or deliberately forgotten in official accounts and public retellings. A glance exchanged in passing under strained circumstances, a carefully chosen phrase delivered with measured intent, or a secured entrance that suddenly assumes greater significance in hindsight as events unfold and consequences become clear. This instance bore the designation of the Windsor Vault incident within palace confines, remembered as a turning point recalled with careful precision by those present and affected by its ripple effects. It commenced as an innocuous petition for temporary access to a Queen Elizabeth heirloom ensemble intended for a significant ceremonial event, something that might have passed with little notice or resistance in less charged circumstances or different times within the court's history. On the surface, it mirrored standard procedure within the intricate and often opaque operations of the royal household, where protocol governs even the smallest requests with layers of formality. A Windsor inventory review entails a confidential audit of recorded royal possessions, verifying existence, authorized users, and stipulated conditions with meticulous care and attention to every detail of protocol and historical precedent. Yet this particular examination harbored risks beneath its routine appearance, for the items in question were no commonplace adornments, but integral elements of a shielded continuum of memory aligned with the late monarch's explicit and thoughtfully considered directives, rendering them less amenable to access than those making the request had anticipated or assumed based on prior experiences. Anne perceived the hazard promptly and with her characteristic clarity of thought and purpose honed by years of dedicated service and observation. Upon entering the vault chamber and noting the request documentation laid out with formal presentation and apparent confidence, she halted, taking in the scene with deliberate and unflinching attention to its broader implications for the family. Without elevating her tone or resorting to dramatic gesture that might escalate tension unnecessarily, she removed her gloves with deliberation, scrutinized the authorization line in detail, and inquired directly as to who had sanctioned Camilla's association with these restricted articles. A restricted item denotes one designated for circumscribed application rather than general use, carrying specific protections and layers of oversight designed to endure beyond immediate needs or personal preferences. Such terminology effectively converted the petition into a violation of established family directives that had been set in place with considerable forethought and intention to protect what mattered most to the late Queen. In that pivotal instant, Anne discerned beyond mere administrative formality to an encroaching pressure upon Elizabeth's preserved legacy, a matter she viewed as non-negotiable and central to the integrity of the family's history and continuity. Charles subsequently engaged her in private conversation, their dialogue penetrating more profoundly than either had perhaps foreseen at the outset, touching upon brotherly concern, sisterly conviction, and the differing weights they placed upon immediate needs versus long-term principles that defined their respective roles. He advocated restraint to avert transforming symbolism into open familial strife, positing composure and flexibility as the best safeguard for all involved in the delicate balance of relationships. Anne, conversely, viewed reticence in the face of such matters as the graver peril to the principles at stake and the memory they honored with their actions. The king sought tranquility amid difficulty and emotional complexity. His sister insisted upon adherence deference to precedent and the clear intentions left behind by their mother. The revelation that reshaped the narrative and strengthened the legal foundation emerged from the careful, methodical work of a senior archivist who located a prior handwritten annotation affixed to the heirloom registry with deliberate placement and archival care that preserved its authority across the years. This registry functions as the authoritative ledger documenting significant royal artifacts and their designations across time, a record maintained with precision and reverence for accuracy and historical truth that few outside the inner circles ever fully appreciate. The annotation cautioned that select pieces must remain immune to reassignment via coercion or marital circumstance alone, a directive noted with care and later pivotal in the proceedings as compelling evidence of intent. That isolated passage supplied the concealed yet robust framework for the legal case, equipping the judiciary with clear justification to wholly dissociate Camilla from the claim in unambiguous terms that left little room for reinterpretation or appeal on emotional grounds alone. The past had not dissipated with the passage of years or changing circumstances. It had bided its time quietly, waiting for relevance to reassert itself in the present moment with quiet authority and undeniable force that could not be ignored. Upon Charles learning of the Windsor Vault incident's invocation in court, any hope of evasion or further avoidance of confrontation became untenable and counterproductive to the family's stability. History now demanded acknowledgement and a full reckoning, bringing previously hidden tensions into sharper and more unavoidable focus for everyone concerned, forcing a confrontation with truths long deferred, but ultimately inescapable in the light of legal scrutiny and familial duty. The gravest royal confrontations seldom transpire in majestic venues beneath the glare of public observation or ceremonial formality that often masks true sentiment and underlying tensions. They unfold instead in secluded, intimate spaces where privacy allows for unvarnished truth, absent cameras, public acclaim, or prepared pronouncements designed to mitigate harm or shape external perception of events as they unfold. This particular encounter featured Charles positioned near the hearth in quiet contemplation of his responsibilities and the human cost involved in the decisions ahead, Camilla seated in resolute quietude that spoke of inner resolve and accumulated experience with public life and private disappointment. William composed yet internally strained by the weight of expectations and future responsibility thrust upon him by birth, and Anne unwavering in her gaze and deeply held convictions about duty and legacy. Charles had convened the assembly because continued silence no longer sufficed as a defense against the forces now at play and the emotions they stirred across the family. The ruling had already inflicted its toll upon Camilla in both practical and deeply emotional terms that could not be ignored or easily dismissed without consequence. The palace, as an institution, confronted a difficult choice: acquiesce discreetly to the judgment or countenance public contestation with outcomes that remained uncertain and potentially damaging to the family's cohesion and public image. A judgment constitutes the tribunal's conclusive determination on a matter of contention, extending here beyond questions of proprietorship to delineate clear constraints upon sovereign sway, affirming that personal aspirations could not permeate every safeguarded domain of royal annals without facing meaningful consequence and lasting scrutiny from both within and without. Camilla at length articulated her perspective during the gathering, her inquiry altering the tenor of the discussion with its directness and emotional honesty born of lived experience and accumulated reflection on her role. She questioned why the prevailing narrative framed the matter purely as safeguarding when it registered to her as something closer to chastisement or pointed exclusion from full belonging in the most meaningful and symbolic ways. Charles regarded her with evident concern and affection tempered by his position, yet a response eluded simplicity amid the competing demands and loyalties placed upon him as both king and husband navigating impossible terrain. He yearned to console as spouse in that charged moment, though obligation and institutional duty interposed an impenetrable barrier forged from tradition, responsibility, and the expectations of his role in preserving stability. Camilla sought not mere pity, but a genuine comprehension of why proximity to the throne still left her estranged from artifacts embodying royal essence and historical continuity in the eyes of the family and its guardians. The ensuing hush bore greater import than any overt reproach, heavy with unvoiced considerations and the complexity of their shared situation under intense pressure from both inside and outside the palace walls. Charles. William interjected ahead of his father with measured thoughtfulness and respect for all present, asserting that this concerned not degradation but fidelity to trust and the larger purpose of preservation for future generations who would inherit these burdens. The heirlooms were never purposed primarily for reputational restoration or personal validation in times of need. Additional restricted artifacts exceeded prior awareness, potentially foreclosing broader future entitlements and access in ways that extended the ruling's reach and implications far beyond the immediate dispute. Charles pivoted toward Anne, seeking the basis of her challenge to his prerogative in this sensitive matter. Her measured reply proved incisive and rooted in unshakable clarity, the originator of the directive itself, whose intentions remained binding across time and circumstance, offering no easy path around the established boundaries. Camilla withdrew her seat and departed the room with quiet dignity after her words had been spoken and heard by those assembled. Charles stood immobilized by the weight and implications of the exchange that had unfolded between them all. William offered no immediate words, allowing the moment its necessary space for reflection and absorption of what had been revealed. Anne maintained equilibrium, her stance unwavering in the face of tension and differing views on the path forward. With the closure of the door, those remaining in the chamber discerned that the ruling's impetus derived not transient anger, but from a structured dominion carefully constructed over time through deliberate acts, documentation, and quiet determinations by previous generations seeking to protect what they held sacred. The jewels transcended mere ornamentation, manifesting memory codified as statute, sorrow transmuted into stewardship, and a historical continuum fortified by indelible endorsements and the quiet intentions of those who came before with wisdom and foresight. Charles apprehended the totality of this architecture when the trust delineation was arrayed before him in full detail and context. This trust comprised a legal construct erected not for expedience or convenience, but for enduring succession and protection, insulating designated objects from monarchical discretion in specific and meaningful ways that served a greater purpose beyond any one reign. Camilla's station accentuated the affliction, placing her at the intersection of formal title and very real limitation in practice and perception. She could appear alongside Charles in ritual and public life with grace and poise, yet the decree effectively precluded unfettered entry into the late Queen's sequestered inheritance and the deeper meanings it carried for the family across generations, highlighting the enduring power of precedent. Charles examined the summary in solitude later that evening, his hand resting proximate to Elizabeth's inscription, as if seeking some form of connection or understanding across the divide of time and loss that now felt more pronounced than ever. Anger might have offered a simpler outlet or temporary release from the pressure weighing upon him. Instead, he encountered a more subdued resignation, the sobering realization that even sovereign authority had met an edifice raised by one he held dear and whose vision continued to exert influence long after her passing, shaping events in ways he could not fully control. Elizabeth had not proclaimed from beyond the veil, but had inscribed her intentions with precision and care, shielded them with discretion, and bequeathed directives resilient enough to outlast him and the immediate pressures of the present moment. Anne conferred with William in an adjacent space, removed from the more immediate pressures surrounding Charles and Camilla, allowing for candid exchange free from the full weight of the king's presence. She conceded that upholding the perimeter of these protections would inflict genuine pain upon her brother, yet dereliction would constitute a profound betrayal of its architect and the principles she had embodied throughout her life of service. William grasped the gravity with the perspective of one positioned to inherit both the role and its accompanying responsibilities in due course, understanding the long shadow such decisions cast. Documentation clearly identified custodians entrusted with operational oversight of access, encompassing their own roles in maintaining the structure and its integrity for generations yet unborn. A legal counsel subsequently apprised Charles that any form of resistance risked disclosing the precise heirlooms contested, transforming private defeat into broader exposure with unpredictable ramifications for the family's public standing and internal harmony, a risk too great to ignore lightly in the delicate balance of monarchy. For Camilla, the repercussions manifested not through public spectacle or dramatic announcement, but via understated denial delivered at her own threshold with formal politeness that did little to ease the underlying sting of limitation and changed circumstances. The revised access roster conveyed the practical implementation of the judgment, rendering prior avenues of approval obsolete one by one began in a quiet but systematic manner that altered established routines and expectations. Access protocols, the governing framework for requests, handling, and utilization of safeguarded items, translated the judicial decree into operational routine that now touched the daily realities of palace life and personal preparation with tangible effect. Ceremonial assemblages underwent stringent re-evaluation under the new constraints imposed by the ruling. Private vault engagements faced restriction and additional layers of scrutiny and review by designated parties acting on established guidelines. To external observers unfamiliar with the nuances, this might resemble ordinary administrative refinement or standard procedure within a complex institution. To Camilla, however, it registered as courteous, yet unmistakable dismissal of certain expectations she had held about her position and its scope. Seated at her dressing table in a moment of private reflection, she absorbed the explanation while removing gloves selected for an impending engagement, an act now tinged with futility and a deeper, more abiding sense of altered reality and adjusted expectations. Certainty itself had eroded, replaced by a more measured and cautious navigation of her place within the royal world and its traditions, forcing a quiet re-evaluation of her path forward amid shifting realities. Charles discovered her shortly thereafter in the quiet of her chambers, the rift between them resistant to easy mitigation or comforting words that might bridge the gap created by recent events and the judgment's full weight. He appeared visibly afflicted by the situation, deeply cognizant that the refusal had preceded his ability to intervene and carried the full weight of institutional process and precedent that bound even a king. Camilla expressed in measured terms her feeling of being merely endured rather than fully integrated into the sacred aspects of the family's ongoing story and traditions. That observation impacted him more acutely than overt fury or direct confrontation might have done in the moment of vulnerability. As sovereign, he found himself balancing spousal devotion and affection against the heavier demands of monarchical obligation in a tension that has defined many who wear the crown across history, often at great personal cost. A subsequent notification mandated custodian mediation for future petitions, effectively positioning William and Anne as gatekeepers over elements once presumed to fall more directly within Charles's remit through personal authority and inclination. The sense of degradation had formalized into institutional structure and procedure. Charles elected to engage William privately in hopes that paternal discourse might yet alleviate some of the strain and misunderstanding, though this particular exchange would distill the crisis to its fundamental emotional verity and the competing pulls of family ties and institutional duty that define their lives in profound and often conflicting ways. No legal counsel or attendants intruded upon this meeting between father and son, allowing for a raw and unfiltered confrontation with a wound neither had fully articulated in prior conversations or public settings. Charles bore not only the weight of regal mandate but the very human anguish of a husband who had witnessed his wife's public diminishment and the monarch's relative impotence to rectify it through simple decree or personal intervention alone. He proposed a moderated accommodation that might permit Camilla limited ceremonial utilization without the need to revisit the legal contest in its entirety or challenge its core. To Charles, this constituted an act of compassion and understanding, not outright defiance of the ruling's core principles or intentions. William absorbed the entreaty with the seriousness and thoughtfulness befitting his position as heir, discerning the latent hazard that any such concession might undermine the verdict's integrity and intimate that heirlooms could serve as instruments of emotional barter or ongoing negotiation. The prince aimed not to vanquish or humiliate his father, but to forestall the conversion of revered memory and symbols into something transactional or subject to short-term pressures and personal circumstances. Sacred emblems demanded preservation beyond individual solace or the immediate repair of relational strains within the family, a principle that tested the bonds between them in this most private of moments. William emphasized during their exchange that exceptions, however well-intentioned they might appear, risked fracturing the protective framework Elizabeth had instituted with care, foresight, and a clear understanding of potential vulnerabilities over time. The court had safeguarded not merely physical objects, but their intrinsic significance and the broader principles they represented within the monarchy's continuity and public trust. Charles recognized the impasse and the depth of conviction held on both sides of the divide created by the ruling. Camilla's exclusion highlighted a monarchy sustained by more than titles, public appearances, differences or momentary accommodations, but by protocols, shared recollections, and the conviction that certain emblems must eclipse personal affliction in the long view of history and institutional strength. The exchange laid bare the often painful cost of internal guardianship and the difficult choices required to maintain continuity amid changing circumstances and generational shifts. Anne's steadfastness and William's vigilance underscored a commitment to continuity over immediate accommodation, even when it strained the closest of family relationships and tested bonds of affection. The family now navigated the enduring tension between personal loyalty and the demands of legacy, where duty frequently exacted its toll in silence, unresolved feelings, and quiet sacrifices made for the greater whole and the institution's survival across uncertain times. In the wake of these events and the emotions they stirred across the palace and beyond, the monarchy confronts enduring questions of authority, inclusion, the nature of belonging, and the proper transmission of heritage across generations in a changing world that demands both adaptation and fidelity to core principles. Charles, Camilla, William, and Anne each embody in their way the intricate interplay of personal bonds, institutional imperatives, and the weight of expectation that has long defined royal life and its inherent challenges. The ruling, while legal in form and structure, resonates as a deeper meditation on boundaries that define not only questions of possession, but matters of identity, legitimacy, and place within a storied lineage shaped by both human frailty and the pursuit of timeless duty. As generations observe and reflect upon such matters with the perspective that time affords, the resolution may yet illuminate how tradition can withstand the pressures of modernity, personal longing, shifting public expectations, and the inevitable passage of time itself. The jewels, resting in their secured repose, serve as a silent testament to a resolve that outlasts any single reign or individual chapter, inviting sober and thoughtful reflection on what truly endures when power meets its limits and memory asserts its quiet, enduring authority over the present and the future yet to unfold.